Well, it seems I've gotten a video response to my video concerning the website Chariots, and this is kind of what I was hoping for, since responding to other videos in a dialogue is a lot easier and less time consuming than making videos from scratch. The only problem is this video I'm responding to is excruciatingly long and boring, so I'm going to have to chop a whole lot out, but let's look at this.
This time, I take a look at an apologist with a rather comedic name of Deflating Atheism as he takes on a website addressing Ansom's cosmological argument in his apparent everlasting quest to call all atheists idiots. Yet, he only reveals that he really has no clue what the hell he's talking about and makes himself look like a fool. No surprise there, so let's get started.
When debating with atheists, they'll almost invariably whip out their favorite stock expression, "There is no evidence for God."
Well, let me make a slight correction here.
Now let me make a slight correction here. This guy has, as his avatar, this little face-palming lion, which is cute, don't get me wrong. The problem is, it's a little undynamic, especially when stretched over the course of 20 minutes. So I'm going to replace this lion with this rapper from the smash hit 1989 film, Teen Witch.
Know it. When I snap my fingers, everybody says sure, I'm hot, and you're not. But if you want to hang with me, I'll give it one shot, top that.
Yes, the song is called Top That, which is actually apropos of the topic of maximally great beings, if you think about it. The lyrics also remind me a little bit of the completely unearned cockiness of atheists in general.
You can dream until you will, but you will never top that.
With that out of the way, let's get back to the video.
Well, let me make a slight correction here. Atheists tend to say that they have seen no evidence for God, therefore they don't believe in it.
In my experience, atheists practically never say that they haven't seen any evidence for God. In my experience, atheists practically always state, as fact, that there is no evidence for God. I could show you Facebook posts from today where an atheist said that there is no evidence for God. So let's do a little experiment. Let's do a Google search for the exact expression, "there is no evidence for God," versus a Google search for the exact expression, "I have seen no evidence for God." A Google search for the exact phrase, "there is no evidence for God," yields 146,000 results. A Google search for the exact phrase, "I have seen no evidence for God," yields, drumroll please, 10. It yields 10 results.
We can only evaluate evidence that we've actually been presented with. If Christians really wanted to prove us wrong, all they have to do is come up with some demonstrable objective evidence for us to examine, and we'll change our minds. When exactly do you think you'll be getting around to doing that?
Why are you so fucking dumb? The kalam, the contingency, the fine-tuning argument, this is all evidence for God, but no matter what the Christian says, the atheist is going to wave it away and then just say there is no evidence for God again. Why would you demand evidence if you already said it doesn't exist?
Well, maybe that's because you completely and totally failed to present any.
You're so fucking dumb, the point flew right over your head. Demanding that a Christian provide you evidence for God is obviously not an honest request, since it's obvious you've already made up your mind that said evidence does not exist. Now, the Christian apologist has several avenues available to them here. They can point to the first cause argument, or the contingency argument, or the fine-tuning of the universe, etc., etc., but no matter what they say, the response is invariably going to be the same. That's been debunked!
Well, it has. But even if it hadn't, none of that is actual evidence for the existence of your particular deity in the real world. What you're arguing are just word games and philosophical masturbation that doesn't actually prove anything. It just makes unwarranted assertions without support.
What you just made are unwarranted assertions without support. All those Christian apologetic arguments are formulated as logical arguments where the conclusions follow necessarily from plausible premises. But hey, if you want to bear the burden of proof for that claim you just made, by all means be my guest. Now, debunked is basically atheist speak for someone somewhere on the internet says this is wrong, therefore the matter is settled once and for all time.
No, it means that it's been clearly demonstrated that the logical justification behind these claims is faulty. That's what debunked means.
This guy's so dumb he doesn't even understand what a joke is. The point stands, simply declaring that an argument has been debunked, as atheists like to do, does not in and of itself debunk it. So declaring that an argument has been debunked, in the context of a debate, is a completely hollow gesture. If you feel an argument has been refuted, you say it's been refuted. Secondly, these people don't seem to understand that if you mount an objection to an argument, someone else can mount an objection to your objection. That's kind of the way the exchange of ideas works. These people don't really seem to get that.
Indeed, you can mount any objections you wish, but in so doing, you have to present something in addition to what was said initially. You can't just keep rephrasing and repeating the same argument over and over and over again, which is all apologists can manage to do.
Hey, guess what? You just made another unsupported assertion. So go ahead, try to prove what you just said. You can start with this video right here. Prove something for once in your life.
In the end, all theological arguments essentially end up with one side having faith that they are correct, and the other side rejecting the arguments for lack of evidence. The only worthwhile response to an unconvinced opponent is to present more evidence.
Yes, you present more evidence if your opponent is reasonable and open-minded. If your opponent refuses to be swayed by any amount of evidence, you're under no obligation to keep jumping through his hoops for all of eternity. Moreover, his refusal to be swayed by evidence is not a vindication of his position. If the atheist refuses to acknowledge that there's any evidence for God, that does not mean that there is no evidence for God.
But the theist has none, or they would have done it already.
Yes, they do, and they have! Why are you so fucking dumb? Now, they quote this as a supposed contradiction to the idea of God's omnipotence, as they seem to think it's saying it was God who could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. In fact, the verse is saying it was Judah and his men who failed to drive out the inhabitants. If this were unclear enough from context, most translations include the pronoun they, indicating it was the men, and not God, who couldn't drive out the inhabitants.
That much is true, but the verse also says that God was with Judah, and if God is so impotent that he can't help Judah overcome some iron chariots, he's a pretty piss-poor God, isn't he?
Again, the verse does not claim God can't do anything. Keep in mind the surrounding context is that of a successful military campaign. Now, in attempting to refute these arguments, they throw a lot of shit at the wall, and none of it really sticks. There's too much to respond to here, so I'll just poke a few holes in some of their objections. My purpose is not so much to defend the ontological argument, as just to illustrate how badly atheists fail at logic.
Newsflash for you, pal. Iron Chariots does not represent all atheists. It represents only the views of the people who actually wrote it. But I'm sure you didn't mean to generalize stupidly, did ya? Oh wait, you did.
Okay, how about this? In my experience, atheists fail at logic, and this Iron Chariots article about the ontological argument is typical of their failures. Is that better?
But that's kind of the point, and that's the central failure of the ontological argument. We can think of all kinds of examples of things that are maximally great, yet don't exist in objective reality.
Well, the ontological argument doesn't deal with all kinds of things that are maximally great. It deals with one greatest possible being, and if something is not that one greatest possible being, how can it be maximally great?
Now, before we go any further, and I have no idea what he's going to say next, I want to examine my personal reasons for rejecting the ontological argument as valid. If we look at the argument again, and it's important to note that this isn't something that Iron Chariots made up. This is actually the Alvin Plantinga version of this argument. It is consistently found in exactly this form across philosophical websites, so we can't be claiming that this is just something that they do. We can start at point number 1, and we need to notice that all of these supposed characteristics of God are just assumptions. They are assertions offered with no evidence as to their validity.
Now this is a perfect example of how badly atheists fail at logic. This guy doesn't even understand how a logical argument works. The characteristics listed in the first premise of Plantinga's argument are necessary conditions for being a maximally excellent being in world W. They're not meant to prove that this maximally excellent being exists. That's what the conclusion does. I can have an argument whose premise is that being unmarried is a necessary condition for being a bachelor. That doesn't prove that bachelors exist, and it's not supposed to.
Christians can't actually show that their God has any of these characteristics because they can't show that their God is actually real. It's just blind faith.
Showing that God is real is what this argument purports to do. Somehow you skipped over all the intermediate steps and conflated the premise with the conclusion. If it were truly blind faith, there wouldn't be an argument to begin with.
It's like telling us what Bigfoot's favorite flavor of ice cream is. How do you know that any of this is true? Well, you don't. How did you test it to find out if it's factually valid? You can't. It's mere supposition presented as fact. So let's keep that in mind.
No, I don't have to keep shit in mind because you completely fail to understand the ontological argument because you're a moron.
Next we move on to point 3, which asserts that something that exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than something that exists only in the mind. Well, it says who? There are plenty of concepts out there that are absolutely not real, that are extremely important and compelling concepts. Take universal peace, for example. Universal peace clearly doesn't exist in the world. It may be a worthy goal to have, and most people would agree that having universal peace is certainly better than having war. But it doesn't have to be real and demonstrable to be worthwhile.
Yes, but universal peace that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than universal peace that exists only in the mind. At this point, your objections are only lending support to the ontological argument. You're a moron.
And even if all of it were true, and not logically problematic, the only conclusion you could possibly come to is that some God exists. A God exists. Not necessarily this particular God, because you've never drawn a direct causal link between these claims about your particular God and the God that's actually real.
This is a non-objection that comes up again and again to all sorts of apologetic arguments. No, the ontological argument doesn't prove that the God of the Bible exists. It doesn't prove that the God of the Koran exists. You have to take the argument on its own terms. It attempts to prove that a necessarily existing monotheist God exists. That's it.
This isn't evidence for a specific God. There are thousands of possible gods that man has invented that he could bow down to, not to mention a virtually infinite number of possible gods that man hasn't made up yet.
Anything can be worshipped as a god. Kim Jong-un can be worshipped as a god. Not everything that's been called a god, however, has the properties of necessary existence and maximal greatness described in the ontological argument.
But people like Anselm, and virtually all modern apologists, they're working from a false dichotomy. Either their particular God, or no gods at all. That's a logical fallacy for a reason.
No, that's something you just pulled out of your ass. Neither Anselm nor any contemporary defenders of the ontological argument are guilty of the fallacy you just described. But hey, if you feel differently, feel free to provide sources.
Unless you can demonstrate using objective evidence that your God, the one that you actually believe exists, really does so in the real world, all you're doing is philosophical masturbation.
Well, if you want an argument for the specific truth of Christianity, I will point you in the direction of arguments for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, provided by Mike Licona and Tim McGrew and Richard Swinburne et al. The evidence for the truth of Christianity is really cumulative. Proof by logic. Here they criticize the ontological for not having any empirical premises, which just shows they completely misapprehend the force of the argument. If the argument was built on an empirical premise, it could only tell us what's true of this world. The ontological argument attempts to show that God exists in every possible world.
Well, that just makes an assumption that there are any other possible worlds, which is yet another blind assertion presented without evidence.
You're really stupid. You're completely unqualified to be discussing philosophy to any degree. As long as you assent to the premise that anything could be otherwise, you're assenting to the existence of other possible worlds. If it's possible that this bracelet could be red instead of green, that's another possible world. If it's possible that I did not have a photograph of a cat on my desk, that would be another possible world.
Everything that theists present is subjective. It is something that relies on having faith before you can think it's so.
Anything that any theist has ever presented has been subjective? That's a tremendous burden of proof you've just strapped to your back, but hey, go ahead and prove what you just said, I'll wait.
Apparently you have to believe it's true before you can believe it's true, and that's fallacious.
Oh, kind of like when atheists say there is no evidence for God. And when you ask them to substantiate that assertion, they say, because there isn't.
Like it or not, unicorns are a fair substitute for God in this argument. They are something that people once believed were real. There were lots of different opinions about what they were and what they could do, and they had no objective evidence whatsoever to support them. And that sounds pretty godlike to me.
Hey bozo, if you're using your assertion that there is no objective evidence for God in your attempt to discredit the ontological argument, you're assuming your own conclusion, which is a logical fallacy. But look at how they absolutely butcher the logic of axiom S5 in premise 3 and in the comments down below. P3 follows from S5 modal logic where all worlds are accessible to each other, so if something is possible in one world, it's possible in all worlds? What the hell are they talking about? Atheists absolutely fail at logic.
Essentially, the arguments are exactly the same. If we took Anselm's argument and replaced every instance of the word God with the word unicorn, it wouldn't substantively change the argument any.
Naturally, the whole S5 modal logic business flew right over this moron's head. He's back to talk about unicorns, which was the argument before, but even taking what he says at face value, if we were to replace every instance of the word God with the word unicorn in Anselm's argument, all it would end up doing is proving the existence of a maximally great being that we call a unicorn instead of God. It's just God by another name. The argument will not prove the existence of some ungulate with hooves and a horn.
In fact, you can plug in virtually anything and it works just as well. I can imagine a maximally great automobile with a given set of characteristics. It is better than any automobile that exists, but it's not real.
You can imagine a maximally great car? So what color is this maximally great car? How fast can it go? Why can't it go 10 miles an hour faster than that? Can it file my taxes for me? See, that's what critics of the ontological argument constantly miss. We're not talking about one of many great things in the world that have all these contingent attributes. We're talking about one greatest possible being that has the necessary attribute of existence.
Well, the one thing I would recommend is not taking a single website and pretending that it speaks for all atheists. That's foolish. Only the person who wrote the article is responsible for its content. You're engaging in a straw man, which really isn't all that surprising. It's something I see a lot of apologists try, claiming that insert argument here is dumb, therefore all atheists are dumb.
Now, there's actually a valid criticism nested in here, which I knowingly leave myself open to in these videos, and which he misidentifies as a straw man fallacy. But yes, I tend to lump all atheists in together, because in my experience, atheists are by and large a pretty doctrinaire bunch, and about 98% of them just mindlessly recite these same talking points that they heard from somewhere else. Now, I know that there are intelligent, thoughtful, critical thinking atheists out there, but they certainly do not represent the majority, and maybe by lumping them in with these morons, I'll light a fire under their ass, and I'll speak out against the morons in their own ranks. Well, as you can see, the sun has come out here, and my lighting's not so good, and I have bags under my eyes. But if you're feeling particularly masochistic, I'm going to leave a link to the original video down below. Be forewarned, this guy basically just talks in circles for minutes upon minutes, repeating the same unsubstantiated assertions. It's really just a sickness, it's a mental illness. But on that note, hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.